Todo está dispuesto, así que comenzaremos con la presentación de nuestros ponentes, que como se dan cuenta ya están sobre el escenario, para la mesa redonda denominada ¿Cuáles son los desafíos para la medición y la implementación de la Agenda de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sustentable? Everything is set now, so let's introduce to our distinguished speakers for the roundtable. What are the measurement and implementation challenges of the new SDG agenda? Como oradores, tenemos a quien es responsable general de estadística en Sudáfrica. As speakers, we welcome on the stage Statistician General, Statistics South Africa, Pali Lihoula. También nos acompaña quien es economista en jefe del Banco Islámico de Desarrollo, Chief Economist of the Islamic Development Bank, Savas Alpai. Director ejecutivo en el Instituto Nacional de Estadísticas y Censos de Ecuador, Executive Director, National Institute of Statistics and Census, Ecuador, José Rosero. Asesor económico para la Oficina Ejecutiva del Secretario General de Naciones Unidas, Economic Advisor, Executive Office of the Secretary General, UN, Joe Colombano. Director General de Integración, Análisis e Investigación del INEGI, Director General of Integration, Analysis and Research, INEGI, México, Enrique Ordaz. Como moderador, presentamos y vamos a dejar en uso de la palabra a quien es profesor de Asuntos Mundiales de la Universidad de Cornell. As moderator, T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs at Cornell University, Ravi Kambur. All yours, sir.
Do we start? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good. Well, friends, let me start by, so I'm a professor, so I have to stand up.
Soy profesor, así que me tengo que...
We have a very distinguished panel here, and I'd like actually to thank the panelists for being ready and flexible. As some of you know, panels change at the drop of a hat, and I really want to thank our panelists for being so flexible and stepping in to take charge of this thing. So that's our really great thanks to all of you for being here. So the title of the session is What are the measurement and implementation challenges of the new SDG agenda? As you know, at the end of September, the UN Secretary General, the UN General Assembly rather, adopted the SDGs, the 17 goals and the 169 targets. And I suppose the reactions have ranged from very, very positive to not so positive. The very positive reactions have been that it's quite remarkable that all the heads of state have put their signatures to this document. It's a political document and it shows political commitment and buy-in at a very high level. I suppose that's a very positive reaction that we've had. On the side of criticism, the criticisms have ranged from very strong criticisms to less strong criticisms as well. And the criticisms have been both of a methodological, technical nature, as well as criticisms of a more political nature. On the methodological side, we've already heard in this conference from Richard Layard and John Helliwell, for example, that they would have liked to have seen subjective measures of well-being as being part of the SDG agenda. In fact, they said that they would have taken it being an 18th goal as a consolation prize, but what they would have wanted is for the whole thing to be structured in terms of life satisfaction and so on. I suppose that is an example of a very strong criticism of this thing. At the other end, we have, as I said, more narrower, more technical criticisms. Essentially, some people saying my subsector should have been in the goals and so on, with very good reasons. But what we have is a political compromise, and that's what we have. And I suppose there's the next set of things is really we have the pragmatists in the middle. And I think the panel comprises those pragmatists who say, look, we have what we have. The train has left the station. What can we now do to make the best use that we can of this political platform that's been provided by the SDG agenda? And that's really what this panel is about. What are the challenges for implementation and for monitoring? And I suppose I would say, from my part, I see there being three possible challenges, three big challenges. One is for country-level implementation. One is the challenge of prioritization. If we have 17 goals and 169 targets, which of those are the statistical officers going to choose to put their resources into, to monitor, etc.? And that's going to be an internal political decision and an internal technical decision for each country. I think that's a challenge for each country that faces. The second, relatedly, is a challenge of capacity of statistical officers. Are the statistical officers actually going, particularly in developing countries, are going to be able to implement this agenda, and what are the mechanisms that they're going to use, using, for example, new methods of data collection and the data evolution to implement this. And the third challenge that I see is one of bringing inclusive monitoring into the exercise. How are voices of civil society going to be incorporated into the work that statistical officers and others are going to do? So in some sense, the challenge is one of inclusive and sustainable monitoring of the inclusive and sustainable development agenda. So we have as I said, we have a very distinguished panel. I'm going to call on them one by one. And what I've asked them to do is to highlight one major implementation challenge that they see and what their answer is to that challenge. Once we've gone through, once we've heard from all the panelists, speaking for about 5 minutes each, we'll then open it out to the audience. And I'd like you to think about, from your perspective, what for you is the single most important implementation challenge? And not just the challenge, what is then your answer to that implementation challenge? And maybe between us then we can have a list of the top 10 implementation challenges and the answers to those top 10 implementation challenges. So let me start by welcoming Pali Leola, the Statistician General of South Africa, to give us his intervention. Pali.
Thank you very much, Ravi. I think the single most biggest challenge that faces the SDGs is what I would term the internecine struggle between the crucial allies of the SDGs themselves. And by this I mean the tyranny of technology and numerology as it emerges and it appears to be poised to undermine the global freedom project espoused by the SDGs. I think I need to take you through why this is the case. How will this come about? I think this will come about as a consequence of the unnegotiated forced marriage of convenience between official statistics and data technology. These two institutions have never had the time to discuss, and they are thrown into a forced marriage, catapulted into the environment of politics without actually being ready. That's the biggest danger that we face. And this is, this phenomena is a phenomenon of the 21st century. Prior to data technology or the data revolution that we see, statistics have always led technology. If you take the processing of censuses using scanner technology, it was an introduction of statisticians. The files that the US uses, the Tiger files, census, the Bureau of the Census uses Tiger files. It was an innovation of the Bureau, and it created conditions for business in the field of GIS. The scanning technology, of course, was used by Kodak, not so well at the beginning, but is now a good technology. Dr. Goodnight of SARS, statistical analysis software, used this, and this has been used by many statistical offices. The IBM with the SPSS, all these are innovations that have been brought by statisticians. But what has created this environment of tyranny is the disruptive technology that the data revolution brings about. And the statistics offices are not necessarily ready for this. And particularly because of its heuristic epistemology. It is a testing ground as you go. Whereas statistics and statisticians are used to using a block that is well-defined, that has been tested over time. But heuristic epistemology that is being driven by a data revolution is what brings a lot of difficulties. And this forced marriage is creating conditions of discomfort. Private sector interests are a big problem unless mitigated and managed in a particular way, can be very dangerous. We shouldn't forget the dot-com bubble. It was driven by agencies of technology, we shouldn't forget about Lehman Brothers. We can't forget about Volkswagen recently. Private sector interests are very problematic. So these things are there, and there should be a lot of other secret processes, like bananas grow under the dark. There must be private sector deals that are going on at the moment. So the application of technology anyway, we must agree that we would regret it very much if we didn't have Google, if we didn't have Facebook, if we didn't have WhatsApp. We would regret that very much, because it is through those facilities that we are here today. So the problem is that we should look at this emergent conflictual interest in data against the shift in the balance of forces of a unipolar system post the demise of USSR and the emerging multipolar environment of China, Russia, US, and the NATO. And data can be a very strong driver of those polarities that are being created at the moment. And I think if we were to be less mindful of that fact, we would be naive. So how have the informational, statistical, and technological vulnerabilities come about? These technological vulnerabilities are because of, as a consequence of a very difficult situation. A situation where there are no national statistics systems, no global statistics systems. There are systems, there are national systems of statistics and global systems of statistics. It might appear polemical, but in the absence of a global system or national system, we have these kinds of problems. If you take the countries, the Nordic countries, by adopting very early on administrative records, they actually adopted data revolution 400 years ago. So when the data revolution comes to be, it finds them well advanced in managing it and adopting it. Other countries, it's very, very difficult to adopt data revolution and work in the course of, in the context of a data revolution. So in those countries, you can conceive of a national system of statistics, a national statistics system rather. I mean, in Latin America, where we are here, we have geography. They used to have INEGI, which is the Institute of Statistics, Geography, and Informatics. I don't know why they became stupid and dropped informatics in their arsenal. Because if you look at the architecture that we need to work with going forward, it must have statistics, it must have geography, it must have informatics as a holistic system that governs our systems, our global systems of information. They've dropped that, probably they will bring that back in the future. So what we need to do to deal with this forced marriage, I think we need to arrange this marriage. It is forced. I think we need to mitigate that forced marriage into an arranged marriage. And through that arrangement, we can deal with this internecine struggle between statistics and technology. We can benefit from the use of technology and statistics by actually taking a pause and looking at the governance arrangements in this environment. Because unless we look at the governance of these systems, we really are poised for a very difficult situation going forward. And we need to get our politics right. And by politics, I mean agreeing on how we deal with our lives. How do we want to proceed? And the SDGs are the platform for dealing with our politics. But the struggle between statistics, technology, and informatics are the things that can actually make or break what we are trying to construct. So I think in conclusion, what I would say is that if we are to deal with the delivery of SDGs, we should heighten the freedoms project enunciated by the SDGs, and we should guard against the tyranny of technology and numerology. Thank you.
But I think there's a very interesting connection between what Pali just said and Joe Stiglitz's talk in the morning, that when we have technological advances, in principle, it makes everybody better off. But of course, there are strong distributional consequences of any technological change depending upon the initial conditions, initial endowments. And I guess, Pali, you're saying that if we have this technological juggernaut coming towards us, then countries are very differently placed to address these issues and to receive that technology. That could lead to conflicts and further things. And that's going to be actually highlighted dramatically as countries try to implement the SDG agenda. So let's move to our next speaker. It's Savas Alpe, who is the chief economist of the Islamic Development Bank. Savas.
I would like to start by thanking the organizers of the World Forum, the OECD, and the people and the government of Mexico, and also INEGI. I think I have a few slides to make this presentation a little more interactive, if they can put it on screen. Is this on?
Yep.
Okay, so of course the global community just 2 weeks ago adopted these 17 goals and 169 indicators. So, okay, this is a very comprehensive one, I see. Okay. So let's just have a maybe quick vision test with all of you. After such a wonderful, wonderful lunch, it will refresh everybody. So I will just want you to look at these 17 goals. I hope it is visible from the backside, just to try to identify 3 most repeated prominent terms that you can see. Just I will give you 30 seconds. Just this will be maybe the fastest vision test that you will have. And I will just in a moment show you the ones that I have highlighted. Okay, so 3 most critical terms according to you. So if we move to the next one, did we? Can we move to the next one? Yeah, these are the ones that now sorry, can we go one back? Yeah. So 3 key terms that I have highlighted is sustainability, inclusiveness, and equality, so in different forms. So just keep these 3 terms. I hope these are matching what you have identified. Now let me just come back to this global wealth distribution. In the last 5-6 years, Credit Suisse is publishing Global Wealth Report every year. And this information is very useful because we don't have much information on wealth, and this has promoted many countries to start getting this wealth data. The world global wealth doubled in the last 15 years, and we have now around 260 trillion global wealth, and we have around $56,000 per capita globally. But what's critical here, if you look at the distribution of the wealth, top 0.1% of global population, which means 35 million, they own around 44% of total wealth globally. And if you look at the bottom 69%, this group of people, 69%, which corresponds to around 3.2 billion people, they own around 3%, even less than 3% of global wealth. So obviously this is not sustainable, this is not inclusive, and this is not equitable. So therefore the SDG 2030 agenda has identified these themes very strategically, and now we are in the right path to address the critical problems. Of course, the next step is the implementation and monitoring of this global agenda that we have already adopted. Regarding implementation and monitoring, I will focus, the biggest challenge will be, according to our analysis, it will be the financing of the implementation of the 17 goals and also financing regarding the monitoring of these 17 goals. We have 169 targets, and now the expert groups are trying to identify the indicators, which will be most likely more than several hundreds. So this will put a big challenge on the shoulders of especially the national statistical offices, and this will require immense financing. So in that sense, the post-2015 development agenda has rightly organized the Addis Ababa meeting before the adoptions of the SDGs in July in Addis, Ethiopia. So the global community now trying to identify the financing mechanisms, the new modalities to make sure that development financing will be ready when we are trying to reach all these 17 goals. And the global community, especially multilateral development banks, they are now working in more close partnership, and they have announced their pledge for the next 15 years. Of course, now we are moving from billions of dollars of development finance to trillions of dollars of development finance, and that will require the involvement of not the public resources, but also private resources, and also the utilization of domestic resources and tax revenues in a much meaningful manner. Of course, traditional source of finance will not be enough to cover all these financing requirements, so there's a big need to have non-traditional source of financing. And in this context, the Islamic Development Bank over the last couple of decades pioneered the development of Islamic finance. And Islamic finance will be bringing new resources into the table, and that will be utilized by our member countries and also by other countries who would like to make use of it. Of course, Islamic finance not only brings new resources, but it also brings new approaches in terms of financing. If you look at 2008-2009 financial crisis, the way our financial system operates is very critical to the stability of our economies, and still we are trying to recover from this crisis, which is being repeated over the last 2 decades, and we need to take certain actions to have a more stable financial system. And in this context, Islamic finance, being very close to the real sector, offers more promising potentials, and we would like to it's not only the resources that Islamic finance will be bringing to the table, but it's also the way the financial system will operate under this new approach will be very useful, because when you lose the stability, when you are hit by the crisis, all hard-won achievements are swept away. And especially the poor segments of our society, they are hardly hit by this crisis, and that is a critical factor that we have to give special attention. I think this will be enough for the first round. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Savas, for emphasizing the financing dimension. It's the financing that's needed to advance the SDGs and the financing that's needed to monitor the SDGs. And so far as financing the monitoring of SDGs, we come back to the point that Pali made, that if you don't have the financing, you have to be very careful of where the financing comes from to do the monitoring of these SDGs. In particular, if it comes from private sector sources versus certain public sector sources, we have to be aware of the consequences of that type of financing for monitoring of the SDGs. So we now move to our third speaker, who is Jose Rosero, the Executive Director of the National Institute of Statistics and Census for Ecuador. Jose.
Muchísimas gracias. Quiero también empezar agradeciendo al INEGI, a la OSDE.
I want to thank the INEGI, the OECD, and the government of Jalisco for allowing us to have this space for thoughts. Moderators has launched a question quite interesting to answer precisely, which is the main challenge, that the countries have in order to measure the agenda of sustainable development goals. I know that measuring the 17 objective and 169 goals is a huge challenge to adapt to a new area of global information demand. The main challenge is not on the indicators. It's not in agreeing which are the indicators throughout which we will be measuring this agenda, which are conceptual frames, methodologies, which are the disaggregations that we must do. The main challenge that we have is an institutional challenge. It's precisely to see which is the institutional architecture that our countries need in order to meet this challenge. So the main challenge that societies are facing, mainly countries in development, is to strengthen our institutionality, which are our statistic systems at a national level, and strengthen national statistics institutions as coordinators of this system at a national level, because it is under our shoulders that we will be coordinating the works carried out of this agenda, global agenda. Strengthening is a need. If we do not strengthen institutionality that we have on statistics, then the agenda, the monitoring of this agenda will be born with a problem, with a great risk of not being able to monitor it or implement it properly. But what is strengthening?
Se necesita al menos dos componentes.
Well, we need at least two components that I will be talking about. Number one is precisely to empower the statistics of offices in order to allow them to guide us. What does this mean? What does guiding mean? It means to generate at least three capacities and empower them. Number one is the capacity of statistics. This is to plan adequately the statistical offering that is necessary to measure global or national agendas. And when we talk about statistical planning, we are not talking about planning at our statistics offices, but we are talking about an integral planification across the statistical national system. This might seem simple, but what we are seeing in countries, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, is that national statistical programs are nearby. We have different centers that are providing statistical information, particularly public institutions that are generating statistical information that is being used officially in order to monitor and follow the agendas. However, they work with neighboring systems, but at the same time they are not well organized. They are not well articulated, therefore they are inefficient. And additional to that, there is a duplicity of efforts. So we need to create a statistical planning system that brings all the different stakeholders together, assigning responsibilities to each of the institutions and obviously defining the periodicity of the generation of data. The second capacity has to do with the regulating capacity. What does regulation imply? Well, to dictate standards to member institutions of the national statistics system. These standards should ensure quality of statistical activities and indicators that result from them. Such standards should be sustained in basic principles of statistics and good practices at a regional level. Moreover, regulations should be aimed at a transparency policy and open data policy. The third capacity that we need to generate is a control capacity that implies assessment of application of all these regulations and standards in order to ensure quality of statistics and statistical operations. It is no good to legislate or to provide standards if we are not able to control in order to assess the quality of operations that take place in the national statistics systems. We're talking about perhaps certification or quality or endorsements at different levels, at different countries. The second component of the strengthening, I said number one is to strengthen this ruling power, and number two is the building and strengthening of statistical capacities inside the system, particularly aimed at not only traditional practices, but to close the gaps among countries and also statistical gaps inside the countries. Oftentimes we see at a domestic level that there is a statistical office that is well set and sound, but there is a national statistical system with institutions providing information that don't have the same capacities. So inside this component, we need to generate capacities in order to nurture human talent with the right skills to cope with this challenge, with new topics, with new methodologies, with new conceptual frameworks and sources as well. We need to work in the establishment of stable positions at a statistical level for human resources and prevent what we are seeing. This is that the high degree of turnover, for example, inside the statistical offices at a national level and in the system per se. And we need to build statistical skills upon innovating in processes which implies being able to cope with the challenge of bringing new sources of information. Latin America and the Caribbean has a debt with respect to bringing and to keep records at a massive level. And this also means innovation in terms of technology to make processes more efficient. What do we need for all of these? Well, we need strong support from our governments, from society as a whole. And of course, supports have to do with budget. Of course, we need resources, and these resources come from the state budget, but also from a commitment of international collaboration in order not only to ensure financing sources for this new offering, but also to strengthen this structure or this architecture at an institutional level. We also need the support from our government and communities and society in order to update the legal framework that we have, and this legal framework that embraces statistical activity, that we need to have this institutional architecture we are talking about, but at the same time that creates information exchange possibilities not only in the private sector but between private and public sector institutions, and providing necessary autonomy to national statistical institutes. And with that, I will say that we need a true commitment to the strengthening of national statistical programs. Otherwise, monitoring of SDGs would be full with problems if we don't do so. Thank you.
For talking about the support needed from society and government for statistical officers, and obviously speaking from ground level experience in the context of Ecuador and other Latin American countries. I think it's sometimes useful also actually to look at the history of statistics and how statistics has been useful in different contexts. A very interesting story in terms of the role of statistics in the Indian independence struggle. Very important. The leaders of the Indian independence struggle in the 1920s and 1930s had all been educated in the good Fabian socialist tradition that if only you could present the numbers on well-being to the powers that be, you could get them to change. So in the 1920s and 30s, when they came back from Cambridge and Oxford and London and so on, they started developing statistics and looking at statistics to show to the British rulers that you're claiming that your rule is good for our society, but here is why it is bad for our society. So statistics was a very important part of the Indian independence struggle. And no wonder then that when independence was won, naturally these people then said, we now want to monitor the consequences of independence for our society. And the Indian National Sample Survey, the longest running national sample survey, systematic one in the developing world, was founded in 1950, 3 years after India got independence. So I think the notion, and that's why in some sense there's this history, and that's why there's support for statistical development in the Indian context. So I think history is important, but social support for statistics is very important, as you point out, Jose. So let us now move to Joe Colombano, who's the economic advisor in the executive office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Joe.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you to OECD and Mexico for hosting us today. I look back at your question on what is the single most difficult challenge for the implementation of the SDGs in your agenda. And I think the answer is quite straightforward, and is one that really we've been dealing with for the past 3 years of this global process. And it's the sheer size of the agenda and the sort of breadth and depth that the agenda has. This is a remarkable departure from the MDGs, from what we used to. Clearly, the new agenda includes all of the MDGs, finishing the jobs and coming to accomplish what we set out to do back then. But it has a much more comprehensive and extensive set of priorities. So we see everything about poverty, as we had in the MDGs, and human development indicators, but in a much more deep way. It's no longer about just reducing whatever percentage of poverty, but it's about eradicating poverty. And not just poverty as a sort of an income measurement, but really all forms of poverty in all its forms is the letter of the agreement. The agenda also moves into the dimension of environmental sustainability in a way that the MDGs never did with the MDG 7. And it's very specific, and it talks of ocean acidification, it talks of land ecosystem, it talks of climate change, of course, and refers to the COP21 Paris process. And then it charters into totally new waters, right, with the all dynamics between conflict and violence and the effect on development. So it is an entirely different animal, really, that we have to deal with. And that obviously creates immense challenges on the implementation and on the measurements that will be associated with this. In this sense, it's also of little consolation that this is a universal agenda. Yes, it applies to all countries, but even the richest and the countries that have the most sophisticated statistical system will struggle. They will really have to redouble their efforts in terms of digesting the scope and depth of this agenda. In that sense, I think it's quite remarkable what was accomplished, because member states, when they went through these long and extensive negotiation, they sort of pushed back against what must have been a very natural temptation to say, look, this is all very nice and interesting and exciting, but we will have to implement this. So let's just stick with what is measurable. And instead, they decided quite consciously that it was the agenda that was meant to drive the statistical developments and not the other way around. Very much the treasure what you measure or measure what you treasure dichotomy. So what is the solution to this large set of issues? Well, in here I'm coming to sort of a more of a UN New York perspective, if you allow me, having heard all my fellow speakers on the country level. And the sort of discussion that we've had internally to our office and the leadership that the Secretary General offered was really to start with extending the consultation to as large a number of people as possible and involving the political level. And that's why he decided to establish, you'll remember, the level panel of eminent person on post-2015 development, the one co-chaired by Prime Minister Cameron, President Yudhoyono of Indonesia, and President Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia. And one of the key recommendations of that panel was to leave no one behind. And the early realization then was that in order to really be true to that, you really need to have a different set of information. You need to have a much bigger set of information, including qualitative information. Mic went off? Okay, thank you. And not only more and better data, but also data delivered in a more timely manner. We can no longer wait for the lag of 1 or 2 years, at least in the best of the cases, to have estimates of poverty and any others of these measures. So this panel is the one that came up with a very good buzzword or phrase of the data revolution. And that sort of created in itself a whole set of dynamics and very positive dynamism. The Secretary General himself heeded the call of the panel and decided to appoint another high-level group, and we're very lucky to have Pali with us. He's one of the members of the what was then called the Independent Expert Advisory Group on the Data Revolution for Sustainable Development. And the task that was set down to them was to really come up with unbundling this notion of data revolution, what it is and what it means, what are the implications for policy making and for achieving the agenda that we are that we just embraced. The outcome of all this body of work was the realization that if the key challenge is the size of the agenda, and if the need is for more, better, and more timely data, then traditional statistics alone was not enough. Obviously, it remains a necessary but perhaps not sufficient part of the answer. The rest of the answer has to be looked into other constituencies, those that can contribute other things to this agenda. And that's why we're looking at technology and innovation as a source of this complement for getting to the answer that we need. That doesn't mean for a moment that traditional statistics is not central to this. It doesn't mean for a moment that just by having a couple of new apps on my smartphone we'll be able to solve all the problems. That's not the issue. What this means is that we have to contend with a whole new set of actors. And here I'm referring to what Pali said a moment ago, and the other two colleagues as well. It's very important to find a way to operate together. And perhaps I'm somewhat more optimistic than I hear Pali being, and I think that we have the platforms in place. We have, this is a discussion that is not entirely new now. It started for a couple of years, and there is great attention to it. But there is a number of challenges, and these are serious challenges, and these are the one that Pali referred to. First of all, is the set of new actors, right? Not just governments. We need to reach out to people that have access to this information, that can produce this data, and this is certainly academia and center of research, but also, very importantly, the private sector, also civil society, also the scientific community at large. Bringing together all these different actors means that the alignment of interest becomes very difficult. And this is what we're struggling with at the moment. A couple of more issues that I'd like to highlight. First of all, the issue of quality and certification, and Pali referred to it, and it's very important. Much of the, if not skepticism, but resistance that we've seen coming from the traditional statistics comes from the fact that, quite rightly, they see themselves as the depository of the sovereign data, the official data that comes with the imprimatur of the government. That means this is the official data of the country. How are we then to contend with the incredible amount of data that is produced on a daily basis, real time, by all sorts of other entities and actors? What does it mean in terms of the effort for standardization, for certification, for cross-comparison, to ensure that this data will be available in the future as we see it now? If that doesn't happen, it will become less useful for the scope of measuring progress on this agenda. The third element that I'd like to introduce, that I think it's incredibly important and it's been somewhat looming over parts of this discussion, is the issue of privacy. We know that technology is such that we can get at a level of disaggregation that is remarkable, and that if it were to be put in the wrong hands, it could very easily lead to abhorrent abuses and violation of human rights and all that. If you think that we can, we ourselves voluntarily provide information to all of the social media and high-tech companies that we deal with every day, and they can have access to not just our sort of consumer preferences and what we buy on the internet, but our background, our health history, perhaps even information such as religious affiliation, ethnicity, and what's not. And you can only imagine what that would be if it were to come in the wrong hands. But as I said, the good news is that this discussion is ongoing, and there are important dates ahead of us. Yes, a couple of dates that I'd like to mention is March 2016 is when the Statistical Commission will meet, and they will produce this set of indicators. I know that many of you are engaged in this process, and I encourage those that are not to become, because it really is important. The other date is later in the spring. I think it's going to be late spring or early summer, when the new World Forum on Data will most likely be organized. This is one of the initiatives that are to be undertaken under the new Global Partnership for Data and Sustainable Development that Mexico, along with the US, Colombia, Kenya, and UN and World Bank and others are putting together. So just to recap now, biggest challenge, the size of the agenda. The solution is this possible, although difficult, marriage between traditional statistics and non-traditional statistics. It does not need to be a marriage made in hell, but like any marriages, especially mixed ones, and I'm speaking from experience here, they need constant negotiation, talking, meeting, and compromise and incremental progress. The platform exists and it can be done. Let me just finish perhaps with one last consideration. This issue of data is very big and it makes headlines all the time. Just a couple of days ago, the big merger of Dell and EMC, a data storage company. The latest winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Professor Deacon of Princeton, is himself someone that did a lot of work on data and statistics. And I think it's quite natural that statistics has been seen for a large time as somewhat of a technical expertise. And I speak as an economist and a user of data. And maybe all this visibility and spotlight at the moment can feel intimidating, and there's a fear of not being able to deliver to the expectation of the international community. But I think that with this sort of attention comes also a huge opportunity for partnership, opportunity perhaps also for increasing resources, which is always a concern. And so if I can end on a positive note, really the invitation to continue on the excitement that we've had in New York on the agreement of the agenda and carry this forward in bringing together these two constituencies.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. To summarize Joe's summary, the challenge is the broadening of the agenda relative to, let's say, to the MDG. The answer is new form, is what he has put under data revolution. But this data revolution itself has some challenges, and Joe provided some answers to those challenges as well. So I think that's a useful framework for us to be thinking about as we go to future. So let's now come to Enrique Ordaz, who's the Director General of Integration, Analysis and Research at INEGI, who are, of course, our hosts in this, co-hosts in this conference.
Muchas gracias, Profesor Cambur. Buenas tardes a todos.
Thank you so much to Kavi Kambur. Yes, Agenda 2030 is complex, and it is complex because it is universal. It not only calls for governments, but society at large. It calls civil society, calls for companies, academia, and scientific community. On the document that has recently been approved by the General Assembly, Transforming Our World, we're talking about the 5 Ps, in English at least, which is people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. So that's why we have those 5 Ps. The implementation of this agenda, and I agree with Joe, that is the main challenge. It implies the conception, design of public policies that normally are grounded on indicators that are underlying those public policies. For national statistics offices, you need to produce a lot of information with solid grounds on methodologies, instruments, and production processes, and that is a great challenge. But I agree with Mr. Rosero, from my viewpoint as well, is that the challenge that they face is that they are steerers of that statistics system. I don't want to repeat what Jose has just mentioned, but I want to tell you a little bit about the experiences on the field. That's what we are looking for. We know that we want indicators that will be quality objectives, timely, disaggregated, and relevant. Therefore, it is necessary to involve all players participating in generation of information, not only those from government, I agree also that we need to involve civil society, and that for that purpose you need a set of requirements. You need to have a sound legal frame over which relies a statistic system. I believe here that talking about the institution must be governing, must show its technical capabilities and show its professionalism. We should not be doubting as a statistic office or projects or surveys and or census. We must show that we master technically everything and restate it before the society on a daily basis. And that is the way that you can um, make it your own. On technical terms, I do believe that we must also do it on when we talk about resources, we need to have technical capability, show what we do, and that will give us the possibility of finding the right resources in order to guarantee the budget that will enable us to put into practice our projects. Fourth, it must be an institution willing to change. I agree with Jose. It is an institution that must be innovative, that is not fearful to go into new subject of a study. Several examples of Mexico that I want to comment on. The creation of a self-information system of justice in Mexico. This is a new field of expertise that has enabled us to establish coordination and link not only with executive powers, but also with the judicial power and legislative power, which are very important, as well as local governments. Measurements on non-remunerated jobs. When we are talking about innovations, and a little bit about the comment that the professor was making on the critic, on the pessimist part of not including well-being. Well, an experience that we already have on the field is the fact of having worked on subjective well-being. We have done it so much. We have applied so many surveys to the households with non-traditional methods that were referred by Joe, which is analysis of big data. We did it with Twitter in this case, and this has enabled us to participate in the group, and I see Dr. Soho here as a member of this independent advisory group for the revolution of data. It is important to agree mechanisms that will enable you to do strategic partnerships within the government, but also with the users. We have also already mentioned academy, private sector. When you want to use big data, non-traditional sources, research centers, some colleagues that are working with us on big data are among us today. And this partnership on the institutional architecture is very important to say that in Mexico we created institutionally expertise committees and linking or liaison bodies that will enable us to know which are the needs of the users. And we have that committee of the development of millennium that will be coming the Sustainable Development Goals Committee that will give us the experience of having worked with different players at a national and international level, and that will enable us to have a working program and an agenda for the future. It should be transparent. We also said it should be open to all opinions. One critic is a free advice, and a claim is service application. So I think that is an important focus because somebody had said that statistic offices, we are kind of square-minded. But I think that we must break this scheme. We need to be open, we need to understand users, and we need to know what is the answer that we must give. if I have a user that comes to me and is giving me a certain amount of money to undertake a program, maybe you cannot put it into practice because of the characteristics of the project, but I can hear him and I can try to understand his need and his concern. 1 minute more? Thank you. With the challenge with data, it has been mentioned we have 169 goals, and you need to have follow up at 3 different levels: local, regional, and global. If it's going to be go from regional to global, and we must be very careful of how we do things. If we're going to do it from bottom to top or top to bottom, because the challenges are different in regard to information. On indicators, they should be simple, disaggregated, oriented to outcomes, and relevant for the SDGs. According to my experience, we had the generation of indicators and the political agenda of the SDGs was on the other side. I did not find, and maybe did not find the link between the indicators, the databases, and the public policies, but I'm not sure, I'm certain. We have around 200 indicators in the interagency group or institutional group, and there's a stress here of monitoring all goals, and you know how they have been formulated or written, worded, and a compact set of indicators. We need to find a balance there, at least at a global level, not necessarily downwards. There are several proposals, there are several frames for indicators, and certainly there will be topic areas where specialized agencies of the United Nations will have to deepen into on the information on those topics. Another topic will be that bodies outside the system like OECD that called us today or have databases and they have capabilities to monitor objectives and data. I think that we should be profiting from their use. There is an important role on regional commissions on the sense that they will be playing a key role on coordination and advisory in order to share knowledge, experience, and define regional frameworks. Obviously, at regional level, tasks or works are huge, and the speed during which they can be put into practice is very important. Normally we range things by sex or by gender, by ranges of age. We have ethnicity, migration, income, education, disability, geographical location, among others. When we talk about one indicator for one goal, we are talking about a matrix, a set of data, and not one indicator, and that we should take it into account and keep it in mind. We have to develop and test methodologies. We're talking about 3 levels, and there's a level where we need concepts, and we need definitions, and we need to test information. And I think that my time is over. Just a last point, as well as Joe. It is very important to link statistics with geographical information system. We're talking about statistics, but I do believe that, as Pali was saying at the beginning, we have to talk about statistic technology, but geography is really, really important. The space dimension should not be neglected. And I do believe that there's some progress made on statistics on the ONU, and I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Enrique, for that very rich presentation. That I took away. One is the last point you made on linking statistics to geography. I think that's a very, very important point. And then you also gave experiences in Mexico of using non-traditional sources of data and linking them to traditional sources of data. And The third, I think, is a phrase which I'll take away with me, which I suppose we should all take away with us, which is, you said, criticism is free advice. I think that's a great phrase for all of us to bear in mind. So, our thanks to the panelists. As I said, things change very rapidly in a conference like this, and the panel didn't look like this only a few short hours ago. So my thanks to our panelists for being very flexible and stepping up to the mark when needed. So thank you very much indeed to the panel. So we now have about 20 minutes or so, I believe. I'm looking at the organizers. How much time do we have? How much time do we have? How much time do we have? 5. Okay, so we'll play it by ear, okay? So we'll go for about 10 minutes or so. What I'd like is to have questions from the audience, and let's remember the point is what, in your view, are the major challenges, and what is your answer to those major challenges? You could respond to the challenges that these people put forward, or put forward your own challenges, or make your own observations. So, the gentleman in the front here, and then I'll go to the person in the back. First here.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I am Rolando Campo. I work at the INEGI. Within the international sphere, I am co-president of a group at the United Nations that has to deal with geospatial information management. What Enrique Orgaz has said about the importance of geospace information, I want to mention that in the United Nations we are already carrying out an effort in order to incorporate within the SDGs some measurements that have to deal with geospatial information, how give them as reference and how to use geospatial tools for those measurements at a global area, regional area, and local area. So my question would be for the statistics heads of office, how can you instrument within these institutions? How would you instrument this kind of information within your institutions? Sugiero.
And then respond. There's a lady at the back there. Yes, in the middle.
Alicia Guzman. I am from Ecuador and I am PhD from the University in Mexico. Governors, we speak about only one specific topic, and I refer to my thesis topic, which is climate change, and I use the database of the OECD to measure flows into Latin America. So I was referring to specific problems of the OECD database. But by the way, I want to tell you that it is the most important one on financial resources for climate. That database is lacking information on the contributions that countries and developments give. And this hides the real gap on financing for climate change. For instance, let's say, for each dollar that developed countries are donating, or countries are asking loans of up to $6. So it seems to me key that when we are talking that we are partners in this scheme of this new SDGs, then we can treat ourselves as partners, let's say in a relationship of equity where the wording, if we are donors and receivers, would be polished, because it gives us some hierarchy where we are not, our contributions are not taken into consideration for topics as important as climate change. That would be the observation that I wanted to make. For the challenge, and this is a challenge for the database that you are going to create.
somebody from way over there, because I think people on that side. I think that I saw a hand go up in that corner. Yes? No? Okay. I thought I saw. How about this in this side? Yes. No, I think there's somebody back. Okay. This gentleman here, and then we'll have one in the. There was a lady here, because we'll have one here and then one in the middle here. No, behind you.
My understanding is that the goal of the sustainable development goals are designed to lead to a world of sustainable well-being. As such, it seems to me that the indicator variables ought to include measures of subjective well-being. What do you think the future of that possibility is?
Yeah. Indeed, John, I don't know if you were in there at the start, but I raised that very question right at the start of the thing, and let's see what our panelists have to say. So we have one more question. The lady in the middle there, you had your hand up, right? That you would, yeah. And then after this, we'll have a response. Did you have your hand up? Yes.
I'll hold it. Oh, I'm sorry. You seem to be looking in that direction. I'm terribly sorry.
It's just my eyes are probably...
Okay. I'm Shailaja Chandra. I'm from India. I'm not a statistician. I'm a former permanent secretary of the Government of India. But having dealt with statisticians and statistics all through my career, I think I would like to raise the question of implementation in a slightly different way. Ultimately, the statistics have to be generated in a way that policymakers, and by policymakers I mean bureaucrats in the first place, to be able to translate what they see and read into language which is palatable to ministers and can be understood by them. There are a lot of worries in I don't know about all countries, but certainly in India, about the competitiveness between the states and India. There are 30 states and union territories. And the competitiveness is not necessarily in terms of development. There are issues like, for instance, are minorities getting ahead, or are the population figures showing something that we should be bothered about? Now, these are very sensitive questions. And the way to get a politician to listen is not necessarily by giving him data. It either comes through the media when the criticism hits, or it is a way of putting them ahead of knowledge that the public has so they're able to take credit for it. Now, I'm not saying that everything should be packaged, but the implementation to be successful has to have a bridge, and that bridge is not necessarily the statistical people. One has to get into the inner working of the ministries where statistical officers work, but they are very low in the hierarchy and are never listened to. So I think the statistical officers need to position themselves in a somewhat different way so that the line ministries, which have the ear of the ministers and the ear of the cabinet whenever it meets, to be able to show where the problems are going to arise and how they can be dealt with long before it becomes a major crisis. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. So I'm looking at the clock here, which is the meeting, so I think we should go back to our panelists. That was raised here. Questions on climate change, the question on the well-being indicators, and then finally the link with the bureaucrats and statistics. Just one observation, madam, from my experience in dealing with the bureaucrats and statisticians. I remember once we were looking at long-run household surveys, which take every 5 years or whatever to do, 3 years, and quick-fire surveys, which tell you what's happening on the ground. Both these messages of these two surveys were saying the same thing, but it wasn't one that the politician in question liked. So he said that and it was a he, said the long-run survey was too out of date because it was 5 years ago. And the quick one was not representative enough, so he's not going to take either of those two observations because he didn't agree with what he was doing. Anyway, let's go around in the same way that we went and just pick up the question that's relevant to you. Pali.
Yes, I'll take the question of geography. I think I envy very much the Latin Americans because they had seized the agenda 100 years ago, look at location as a critical element of statistics. I think that has to be, unfortunately, I think what we are doing at the United Nations Statistics Commission is that we have created a parallel system to look at geography instead of embedding both things at the same time. We want to transform, but we don't want to transform. I think it's a major weakness of the system at the moment. At country level, the statistics office, or that office, whatever it might be called, must embed geography and statistics and informatics as a matter of a point of departure. On the question of the issue that the Secretary raises, certainly politics must be the number one agenda of a statistician, not to be political, but to understand the politics. That is the way of organizing life in a country. That's the meaning of politics. That we have to understand. Then you can be a geographer, then you can look at logistics, then, of course, finally, you have to be a statistician. But priority must be understanding how life is organized in a country in order to advise appropriately.
Good. Savas?
Yeah, I will take the question on climate change. I think this issue is getting more and more attention, and I was at the World Bank IMF annual meetings just 2-3 days ago, and the issue of climate change was high on the agenda. We had a ministerial meeting on climate change, finance ministers, and as mentioned yesterday by the OECD, the $100 billion promise from developed countries to developing world is now almost 62% is on the table. So it's moving, I think, in the right direction. And in Paris, in December, this issue will be hopefully agreed upon in a positive manner. And we have already some new financing facilities all generated, like Green Environment, Global Environment Facility and Green Climate Fund. So these are already moving. So I think there is a positive momentum now. And hopefully in Paris we will have a big agreement on this critical issue. Thank you.
Well, before I move on, let me just say that on the financing front, there are, of course, concerns, as we all know. Whether there'll be additional financing is a question of whether things will simply be relabeled as being under the climate change, etc. I think that's something that all of us have to watch out for really strongly, because the $100 billion sounds good coming out of Paris, but if in fact it's relabeling of other things, in fact we may not get any strict additionality in the flow at all. And I think financing is a key element, as you raise the point, Savas.
Yeah, just on this issue was also raised in the finance ministerial meeting by India and China.
Yes, absolutely.
And OECD Secretary General clearly mentioned that they are taking care of this issue as well.
Well,
in their collection, hopefully, this will be on the positive side.
So we'll see what's meant by taking care of the of the issue. Jose.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. With respect to geography, and to elaborate a little bit on Pali, the Latin American people are sharing these things, but mainly Mexico and Brazil, who are able to integrate geography and statistics. In Ecuador, we don't have that. We would love to have that, but we don't yet have that. We understand the role of geography in statistics, and in Ecuador, we are taking steps in order to try to think in a merging of these institutions. But in the meantime, we need to take one step at a time, and the Statistics Institute is now part of the framework, and the Institute of Geography as well is part of the Board of Statistics. I mean, we are integrating and complementing each other, but not yet in full, not yet. Now, with respect to the future of measurement of well-being, regardless whether it is explicit or not in the development in the SDGs, I think that the future is quite bright. I think that statistical teams are thinking on contributing with alternatives to break traditional paradigms for the measurement at our own institutes. In Ecuador, we are developing what we call the metrics of the well-being, of the good living. That is our proposal of a new paradigm. This is to understand well-being. And wrap up by talking about the last question, I think that it is important to take messages to politicians. Nevertheless, our systems, our statistical systems, have been created with a bias at the public sector and towards the government. That is shifting as we have a transparent statistics institute with an open policy of data, with a culture of statistics, and where people embrace that information. And that goes hand in hand to work with accountability. And so that is why it is important to strengthen in terms of statistic culture. And Joe?
Subjective measure of well-being. Absolutely, I agree. I think they should be part of this, and I would certainly encourage anyone that wants to bring them up to engage with the process. It will remain as open and transparent as we meant it to be from the very beginning. The Secretary General wanted it to be like that. The sort of gatekeepers of this conversation are the Statistical Commission itself, but also the office within the United Nations that supports that exercise in our Department of Economic and Social Affairs. If I can also add one small comment on the question that came about the link between statisticians and bureaucracy. I think I'd like to take it from the angle of communication. I think it's a very important point, and very much in the back mind of all of us when we're working on this agenda. How do you make something that is, especially because this is a non-legally binding agenda, unlike the climate change. So no parliament will be required to translate this into a law. And so it's very important for it to be as persuasive and powerful as it can be from the offstart. And our contribution to that was to push for these 5 Ps that were mentioned earlier: people, planet, prosperity, partnership, and peace, which in a way hit all of the dimensions of the agenda and that are certainly high on the agenda of any politicians. We have developed a number of ways to go forward. I would encourage you, the statisticians, to come up with ways that are accessible to transmit what statistics means. And here I think that, again, technology and big data has a big role to play.
Good. Well, last but certainly not least, because it's our co-host institution, INEGI, Enrique, please.
Gracias. Bueno, en primer lugar, sobre bienestar.
Well, first of all, talking about well-being and subjective well-being, I agree. Regardless on how we conceive in the list, in the initial list rather, we're talking a 15-year agenda. And I think that when we talk about subjective well-being and well-being in general, this topic should move towards the center of the agenda. And I'm sure that in the next 2 or 3 years, as we move forward in the agenda, we will see this. Another thing has to do with the question or with the need in creating these bridges between statisticians and bureaucrats. I think that this has to do with communication, and we will have a plan of communication for indicators. But it also has to do with a session that held yesterday that has to do with trust. That is, what is the credibility, the trust of institutions, of governments in their own statistics offices. And based on my experience in some Latin American countries, it is not always present. And number 3, and lastly, is something that I did not have an opportunity to mention, is that we need to strengthen collaboration South-South. The Mexico government is committed with this. Bueno, damas y caballeros.
As I said, our panelists have really done a great job because they stepped forward at the last minute and really I want to thank them. And let's also thank them for a wonderful session. Thank you.
Muchas gracias para las participaciones y por la presencia de todos nuestros panelistas. Señoras y señores, como se dan cuenta, tenemos un ligero retraso en los trabajos de nuestras sesiones, por lo que para su información se ajustarán los horarios de las sesiones paralelas, así que no se preocupe, gracias por su comprensión, permanezca aquí en la plenaria. Vamos a continuar inmediatamente con la siguiente mesa redonda, así que por favor solamente estén informados, estén informadas de que se ajustarán a este leve retraso los horarios de las sesiones paralelas. We are running late as you can see now, ladies and gentlemen. So for your information, schedules of the parallel sessions will be adjusted. Thank you for your comprehension. We'll be back in a minute. Por favor, permanezcan en sus lugares. Vamos a iniciar en un momento.